Hello and welcome to the Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative's fourth webinar in our series. Our series is called Lessons from the Field in a Time of Rapid Change and Crisis. To everyone who signed on today, thank you so much for joining us. Today we'll be talking to Molly Loomis Tyson, who's on the other end here, and I will introduce here in a minute. And I'm very excited to have Molly here with us today. For those of you who are joining for the first time, my name is Ben Williamson, and I'm the Executive Director here at NRCC. This is part 4 of our 6-part webinar series. We launched this series this year to give some of our research associates a chance to discuss how they approach their work as leaders and educators and how they're making sense of the complex and multiple crisis moment we are in as a country. And if you've joined for any of the first 3, you've known that each of these conversations has a slightly different tone to each of them, but they're all structured around the same 5 questions. And so I'll try to keep this as conversational as possible. And then I'll pose a question and let Molly respond and then move on to the next. And then we'll leave about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So if you have a question, feel free to start typing it into the chat box, and then we'll get to that at the end. One other quick note, we have 2 more sessions after today. So if you haven't registered, go ahead and do that on Zoom. And then if you've missed any and would like to watch them, they will be available on our website under the Summer Webinar Series tab, and just click on the profile picture, and that will bring you to the YouTube video. That's it for logistics. So I'll just jump right into today's introduction. So today's speaker is Molly Loomis Tyson. Molly has lived in the Tetons for nearly 20 years, and she's currently joining us from her home on the other side of the pass in Victor, Idaho. Molly is a writer, a teacher, a climbing ranger, and has a wide array of experiences and interests, including problem solving, conflict resolution, communication, and education around human wildlife conduct and public land management. Molly has published over 300 articles in major publications, including Outside Magazine, the Smithsonian, National Geographic, and many others. And she explores the themes of a connection to place and what that means for many different types of people and how that can be transformed into advocacy and real world action. Molly has spent nearly 2 decades as a mountain guide, an outdoor educator, and a climbing ranger. She's worked for EXA Mountain Guides, Knowles as a Jenny Lake climbing ranger, and has led climbing and skiing expeditions all over the globe with numerous first ascents and descents. And if you know Molly, you would never know that she has all that experience. She's very humble with her mountain accomplishments. And that breadth of experience eventually led Molly back to school, where she just recently graduated with a master's from the Yale School of the Environment. And at Yale, she focused on human wildlife issues, environmental ethics, and she sharpened her skills as an educator. And she thinks very critically about environmental studies programs in higher education. Molly's back in Teton Valley, and she's starting several writing projects and sort of staging her next steps. Molly is just an interesting character. She has all these years of experience in climbing. She also really thinks clearly about animals and landscapes. She's interested in policy and education and can communicate all that through writing. So we are in for a treat today. And I'm certain we'll all come away with a little bit more nuanced perspective on human relationship to the environment, especially here in the GYE. So I'd like to say welcome to Molly, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Ben, for all of that. Yeah, really appreciate that. And thank you to everyone who's joining us for lunch, or I promised a good educational moment for those of you that are homeschooling kids right now, and this could be a pod activity. So yeah, if there are any school folks out there, hello. And a shout out, if you are watching, to Reese Weeder, who is celebrating her 11th birthday today. So yeah, and her dad is a soil scientist at formerly CU Boulder and now NCAR. So yeah.
Happy birthday to Reese. Cool. Well, we'll just start right off here. Are you ready, Molly?
Sure.
Ready?
Yeah.
Okay. So question number one, just to start us off, basically in your words, however you want to describe it, what do you do now? And tell us how you got there. And overall, how does this work? Why does this work matter to you now?
Great. Excuse me. Well, I'm doing a bit of decompressing now, just from being in school the last 2 years and moving back to the Tetons from the East Coast. I guess I needed confirmation that I'm not meant to be in an urban place. Because even though New Haven is urban light, I guess, it was a lot for me. So it's just so wonderful to be back in a place where that the natural world is more evident. And I do a lot of writing. I've transitioned the last number of years to, I've always written mixed writing and outdoor ed guiding, more recently being a climbing ranger with writing, and then now it's transitioning, it has transitioned last number of years to more of writing being my focus. And I guess I see that as a form of education still, because I also teach writing workshops, and the aim with my writing is to educate. So.
When did you first decide writing was going to be your medium or your focus?
Well, actually, I always loved to write. This was not planned. And we moved around a lot, but I mostly grew up in the Bay Area or spent a lot of time there. And I always loved writing.Maybe it was being an only child, I had to keep myself busy somehow. And this is a book about, this is called A Whale in the World. And it's about, I think his name was Humphrey, who he swum up the San Francisco Bay, dedicated to Humphrey the whale, who was really in the Delta. So
wow.
So there you have it.
That was your first published piece.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Wow. And maybe what sort of writing projects are you sort of starting on today, or what are you working on right now?
Right now, really excited to be working with Dr. Clark, NRCC's founder and GIC founder many years ago, Greater Yellowstone Coalition. Working with her on some projects about environmental studies and sciences, which going back to school, I think at a later stage in life was really interesting to have a different perspective, I think, maybe than folks coming right out of undergrad. So that's, and also having a background in outdoor education versus more traditional. And then also working on a project I started quite a while back, and got put on hold for a while, but a book project on Dr. Luann Freer, who started up a clinic at the medical clinic at the base of Mount Everest, and sort of her journey of starting that clinic and using those rescue high altitude medicine climbing stories to educate folks and talk some about the social justice issues, high altitude medicine, all those sorts of things. She's an amazing, inspiring woman. So, wow. Yeah, I still have my fingers in the climbing recreation world as I can. So,
when was the last time you were in the Everest region?
In 2015, my late husband Andy Tyson, we were over there working for the Khumbu Climbing Center, teaching climbing and rescue skills to the high altitude mountain workers, many of whom are Sherpa, in the Khumbu, which is the valley that leads up to Mount Everest. So, yeah, so it's been a bit now. I would love to go back, but yeah, they're now there's an obvious thing,
Mm.
halting travel. So.
Mm. This is why I love talking to you, because I always get stories that I would have never expected. You have such a wealth of experience.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to the second question. And this is sort of a two-part question. And basically trying to understand how you're just making sense of all that is happening in the world right now. And don't feel any pressure to synthesize all of it because it's so much, but more just trying to understand your kind of personal view of these developments. So the first question, more basic, is just how has your own work and thinking been affected by the pandemic? And you just finished school, so that's probably part of it. And then at sort of the second level, and take this how you'd like, but given the place we're at, given sort of the eroding democracy we're living in, many of the blatant disregard for human rights and the recent examples of police brutality that we've seen, and then all the continued dismantling of environmental regulations. One example of that is the recent rolling back and opening up for drilling on the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska, both of which I know you've traveled to and written about. So basically, how are you reflecting and thinking about all these different developments right now and your place within that context?
Yeah, I think for me, I have a history of a spinal cord disorder and all the associated things that come with that for my particular case. And so I'm pretty sensitive to the public health angle of COVID. And it was a very interesting, it has been a very interesting process, continues to be, to see how other people take that public health, the fact that it's not just you're impacting, but others. For me, it comes in the form of antibiotics. So it's something I've felt or thought a lot about. But also the isolation that sort of the population at large is experiencing, the impact of other people's habits on them, the anxiety of potentially getting something, not knowing when or where it might come from. And I think that these are things that many people with chronic health issues experience all the time. And so I do hope that there is a degree of extended empathy that may come from COVID in empathizing with what many people is sort of their daily existence and daily life. On the other side of it, I'm excited that it may open a lot of doors for people with access challenges, whether that access is due to age or location or health condition. These are areas of diversity and equity that aren't always talked about as much, at least in the conversations I've been around, but they're very real and they're very disempowering, dehumanizing, all of those important realities. And it's really cool to see how people's, the powers that be, CEOs, bosses, schools, teachers, I encountered some professors who this really forced them to open their minds to what was possible doing remotely or online, those sorts of things. So hopefully it's going to change opportunities for a lot of people in a positive way. So, and I think having just gotten out of school and transitioning back here to the Tetons, being around a lot more people who have children of their own and friends that are teachers or work in the public health area, it has been, just very weighty and hard to see the stress that they are experiencing, trying to figure out what to do for their kids, for education, and what's the most responsible thing to do, best for their kids. And it is interesting, and I'm seeing this both at Yale in terms of some of the student chatter, but also in the community here. This to me would be a time when environmental education and aspects of experiential education could really shine through, especially in university settings where environment is the focus, and also places that are a bit more comfortable with time outside, like Teton Valley, Jackson, Bozeman, all these places. And it's interesting to hear through friends' conversations, the discomfort and sort of, I'm surprised at the lack of thinking out of the box a bit in terms of what we could do being outside.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, so I guess there's fear that we're losing a tremendous opportunity to try to do something different, because the crisis is so real and so all-consuming for so many people. So, yeah.
I'm wondering, like, I think that's a really good point around barriers for ability and disability and how we talk about that. And how do you see that sort of those access barriers? How do
So
they relate to environmental
I don't know if
education?
you guys heard her growl.
Callie?
Yeah.
So like, how do you see ability and disability being worked into environmental education curriculum? Like, there seems to be clear barriers for entry for folks for getting outside if you don't have access as easily given your like your bodily function or however you want to define that. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, no, I think it absolutely does. But I also think that it depends how you're defining being outside. If you're defining being outside as if one is defining being outside as just outdoor recreation, then yeah, that is challenging. If one is defining being outside as simply looking out your window at the leaves turning on a branch and taking in the lessons that you can from that, watching the sunset, seeing, feeling the sun move across a room, those are things that I guess I would argue those are the sorts of things most people can experience, no matter if you're in an urban area or not. Sometimes, of course, it takes a little more work, more clothing and blankets and techniques to stay warm or shaded, all these sorts of things that when you teach outdoor ed become sort of second nature, dealing with the physical environment to keep people comfortable. So.
That's a really great answer. Yeah. I often think about how we think about being outdoors as this sort of intense thing that we need all this gear for, and truly like that's not the case. So it's cool to hear you say that.
Yeah, I did, I guess my first year in school I did, and perhaps some of you saw it, a talk on sense of place at the Wildlife Symposium, and this writing project, which is still ongoing, lots of projects I continue working on, to me, thinking about how strong the sense of place is in the greater Yellowstone and how latitude is a driver of what creates the ecosystem, for obvious reasons. We're higher up, it would be different, lower down, different. And so I followed, we're at 43rd about the 43rd parallel here. So I tried driving east to follow as closely as I could the 43rd parallel, and asking people along the way, what does sense of place mean to them? And it was really interesting how these were just, somebody in a gas station, someone in a restaurant, very intentionally random people. And it was really interesting to see, often the question would confuse people. They would need further explanation of what I meant by that. And then eventually, if they did have a concrete connection to the land, it was a fishing, hunting, recreation. It was always recreation based, with the exception of water. A few people did mention water. But to me, it was really interesting that yeah, we've come to define, the people I was speaking to at least, and I would say a lot of people have come to define relationship with nature outdoors as purely a recreation thing, whereas any human being on this planet, you need the water, you need clean air, you need healthy soil. It doesn't matter where you are. Those things, as seen in Flint, which is one of the cities that I drove through, those are all critical. But our definition of nature environment has become aligned with an activity, really, I think.
Did you see a difference in folks that you asked in rural areas versus urban areas, that question?
Yeah, gosh, I'm trying to think. I guess I thought there would be more of a difference, and not so much. It often, when it did get to the kind of the more meat of it, the people in more rural areas would mention hunting, fishing, four-wheeling, but yeah, that was not as much as there wasn't as much of a shift as I thought. And it could just be the language too I was using that that was unfamiliar for folks. But
I wonder what would, like, what's a different way to ask that question, do you think? Like, that, what is a sense of place or sense of nature? Do you think there's a more accessible way to ask that?
Well, I started then, I would ask that initially because I was trying to be a little semi-scientific, like asking a broad, the same question and seeing what response people gave. But then how do you connect with this place you're in, like the land, the animals, the water? And if that didn't bring anything to mind, because many people at that point saw it as a luxury. Well, I don't have time for that. Which, yeah, and not everyone has time to recreate, but you know, we're all everyone still is, you know, using the water, using the land, whether they're reflecting on it or not. And then it would be, well, is there anything a special place that you like to go around here, or a activity that you like to do, and then I would get even more direct. You know, how about, are you concerned, or do you think about the water quality or the animals here? Are there any things that come to mind when you think about those things? So,
okay,
yeah, it was
a lot of prodding.
Yeah, depending on where the initial questions would go. Yeah.
That's a really interesting project, and I've heard you talk about it several times, and continually to look forward to, like, what you write about that.
Yeah, I hope that maybe someday I would love to go all the way around the world doing it.
That would be cool.
That'd be pretty neat, yeah.
So that actually relates to the next question, and it sort of has to do with sort of the philosophy that the NRCC has always promoted, sort of seeing environmental problems as very much human problems, and thinking about the context that the environment, what we label as environment, the human context that you're working within. And I think that's interesting as a writer, and that you're always sort of having to understand other people's perspectives of their context. So my sort of question is how do you seek to be contextual in your work and interdisciplinary, which is very related to that? And then maybe more easier to word that is just, how do you relate to those people that you work with or write about? And I know you've written in many different contexts, so just the question is, how do you be contextual in your work as a writer?
Yeah, I think it was somewhat of a shock to me being in school, and that's not to disregard. I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to go back to school. Excuse me, but I for undergrad I went to Colorado College, which it operates on a block plan, so you only take one class at a time for 3.5 weeks. That you're the professor, that's the only class they're teaching. And so there's a lot of opportunity for immersion education, where you're actually going to the place and talking to people, or seeing things with your own eyes. it was interesting for me, and then journalism, having worked in that context for a while, where I feel and been taught that it's my job to tell a story from multiple angles. There's a great Hemingway quote that said something to the effect of, as a writer, it's not my job to judge, it's my job to understand. And so as a writer, I don't feel like I've really done a thorough or good job unless I've tried to look at a story from as many angles as possible and see the commonalities between the different views and where they differ. So it was really interesting to be in school, where I feel like the emphasis is on being an expert in a very specific topic, subject matter, and also a lot of emphasis on judging and analyzing, even though I'm analyzing and judging right now, clearly. But that to me was an interesting process. So I think I'm the context, or that social context, yeah, needing, if I am approaching a story when I'm writing already thinking I know the answer to the story or what people are going to say, then I'm not really doing my job as a listener. And I think that directly applies to the idea of what the policy sciences focuses on in trying to listen to everyone's perspective and stories, and to the question of that commonality, or how, connecting with other people with different viewpoints. As anyone out there who's guided or been a teacher knows, like that's sort of, you're with different clients or students all the time, like, and that's kind of part of your job, is really to find a way to connect. And sometimes it's exhausting and takes a lot of work, and sometimes you maybe never find that point to connect on, but that is a big part of the job. So those two sort of come together for me, I guess, if that makes sense at all.
Yeah, no, it does. And I think it's interesting that you started your undergrad at like a really explicitly place-based institution, and ended up graduate work and maybe an acontextual, being the best technocratic expert in all these areas that you can be. So those do feel contrasted. You mentioned the policy sciences, and I'm wondering, for just our listeners here, if you could just maybe briefly explain what that is and like what your understanding of that is. A couple other people in our series have mentioned it, but we haven't really like answered what that is. So in your understanding, what are the policy sciences?
I think it's a hard name. It would be better if it were a more, it's a very technical, sort of, I think, intimidating name for most of us, that it really, it's I see it as sort of kind of a philosophy, a big high level in the sense of not inaccessible, but just taking a very like 30,000 foot view of things and figuring out how, trying to give some sort of guide or goalposts for how to narrow in on a problem, and certainly taking into account the human aspect of it. And to me, that's one of the most appealing parts of it, because I do think that human element, in terms of, the kind of nitty gritty deep stuff like anxieties and fears and psychology, that is what drives our decision making. And so the fact that this is a framework that incorporates things like psychology and sociology and anthropology without not naming them so explicitly, I think makes it a really useful tool for a way to approach a problem or a situation.
someone told me that they call it a pattern recognition framework, and that feels that's helpful for me. It's like a way to see patterns.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a great way to put it. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And then I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your experience with human wildlife conflict, and like what areas have you worked in, and maybe have you used the policy sciences with human wildlife work, and maybe an example from before you went to grad school, or a project you did in grad school. Yeah, I know that's a
Sure.
focus of yours. Yeah.
Yeah, in school, I guess a bigger project I worked on was the China's Belt and Road Initiative, which I had not heard of before going to school. And it's basically this massive effort on the part of China to recreate a modern version of the Silk Road, stretching into really every port imaginable, with the exception of North America. And though I don't know what the current status is with COVID-19, but yeah, it's mind-boggling what they're intending to do, and already are starting to do in some places. And in many places, the infrastructure of rail and road is cutting through. I mean, it doesn't have to be in a national park for it to be impacting humans and or creating human wildlife conflict. But in the instance we were looking at with some other classmates is the road pushing right through Langtang National Park in Nepal. And some of the concerns there, for obvious reasons, going right through a national park. And in a lot of cases, these countries that China's working with countries that don't necessarily have a very stable government. So it's debatable what level of accountability there will be in adhering to the high level of green standards that China has said it will use. But it was a great opportunity to work with WWF in Nepal. And unfortunately, the infrastructure gentleman there was going to come over for the Belton Road conference that Yale puts on, has started putting on the last, I think, 3 years, but it was right when COVID started hitting. So the conference got canceled, but he was one of the first to say, I don't think I'm not able to travel right now. But it was a great opportunity to learn a lot about the different nuances and techniques for wildlife friendly roads that are being employed in different parts of the world. And China actually has created one, it built a highway, I think it's on the Tibetan Plateau, with I believe it's antelope in mind. It doesn't get at the root issue of why are we building roads there in the first place, and is there a way to minimize more the traffic? But there are technical solutions out there of all sorts that people are focusing on. So
that feels a little different than how we treat wildlife corridors around here, and that we're kind of retrograding our highways with crossings.
Yeah.
Versus that situation where they're like maybe planning for wildlife in mind when they're building roads. But was that your experience?
It is. Well, that, I guess that's the hope, and that's the opportunity that lies in the Belton Road. That could occur. Whether or not that does is another question, and that's pretty country dependent. It's either Kenya or Tanzania where the road, because likewise the road goes right through a national park, and in phase 1 they built the road, and thankfully they learned from the mistake, or some things that could have been different in phase 2, and made those alterations for phase 2 of the road, so it would benefit wildlife even more. So So if that openness to adapting the plan remains, then it could be an opportunity.
Mhm.
So,
Did you end up, what was sort of the outcome of that project? Did you make recommendations to WWF, or what came of that?
no, was it was more just a presentation,
Cool.
so yeah, it was a big one to try to wrap our heads around,
Mm,
all the, particularly like a place like Nepal, where the uncertainty of the government, and there's a level of corruption in a lot of countries that's hard to figure out how to work with. That yeah, it was a good thought
yeah.
exercise. So, yeah.
It's such a complicated case given the transnational nature of this project that China's working on. So yeah, it's a huge thing. And I having studied a little bit of it myself, it's like, it's gonna be one of the biggest like geopolitical forces of the next 50 years. It's big.
And I'd say, here locally, a experience that comes to mind, is I think my perspective really changed from when I was working as a outdoor educator and then guide to when I was a ranger, and being outside with sort of a different lens on, where my job was protection, versus, and certainly education, but primarily protection, trying to educate people on how to protect, the environment, versus the more recreation. And that changed me a lot, I would say. Like I came into it, yeah, let's open the creeks for pack rafting and the bike trail. And after seeing so many interactions between humans and wildlife and just the habitat, that really shifted. And I remember, because I think the realization I came to, or the way I interpreted it at least, was, I'd say by and large, the community, my friends that I'm a part of, like, yes, we are very responsible backcountry travelers. What I was less aware of prior to being a ranger was what a minority that is, and how the sort of 99%, not out of malice or bad intention, but how they often interact with the environment. And I don't think you're as aware of that when you're insulated in your own group of people who all have a same high standard of what it means to travel responsibly in the backcountry. And I remember taking a drive home on the Moose Wilson Road with a friend, and we were talking about, she's a big biker, also was a Knowles instructor for a long time, and we were sort of debating the bike path through the Moose Wilson corridor there. For those of you who aren't familiar with the area, it's a just so rich in wildlife, riparian habitat, that runs from the small town of Wilson to one of the park entrances in Moose. And there's been controversy, many in favor, many against, of building a bike pathway through there. It's a sort of narrow old dirt road. And I was expressing that, initially I had been all in favor for the bike path, but with time I'd sort of grown against it. After having seen so many instances of wildlife really struggling to cross both the bike path and then the road, and seeing that stress in the animals as they would dart back and forth. Oh, here comes somebody on the bike path, got to go back. Oh, now here comes a car. And sure enough, we rounded a bend and there was a black bear, and we watched there's not a bike path there, so it was just the road. But watching this friend who was very much in favor of the bike path, watching a black bear go through that same stress cycle of trying to cross the road. So I think that gave her a lot of food for thought. So
Yeah, that road is so busy on its own, like with another bike path. it's hard to imagine how wildlife would be able to move through there.
Yeah.
So that kind of gets to my fourth question that I wanted to ask, and I think this is just particularly relevant to your story, but sort of how have you evolved over the years in thinking about environmental problems, and how you've sort of changed, and maybe even thinking about the environmental movement, how that's sort of, we're 50 years past when it was started, and sort of how did you, maybe you've kind of touched on it, you sort of started maybe from a recreation mindset, but have evolved since. And so maybe just speak a little bit more about how you've changed over the years around your environmental thinking.
Yeah, I think I my focus for many years was recreation, and I've always appreciated too. Natural history has always been an interest and something I've loved, but by much in part because of the spinal cord injury, I'm no longer able to do the things that I once did in the way I did in the backcountry. And that you could say forced, you could say gave me the opportunity to need, really I needed to redefine how I was going to engage with the non-human world. And so for me, like that going back to one of your initial questions, like, does being outside just have to be about climbing, or can it be about lying in a hammock and watching the leaves on a willow tree? And that shifted a lot for me out of necessity, really. And it's kind of what kept me going a lot. So I guess I feel a deep sense of obligation that it's not just a right to be outside, but there's also a lot of responsibility to engaging and protecting that has given me so much. So
that's very cool. And I like, especially in the GOIE, how heavy the focus on recreation with mountain biking, climbing, skiing. It's like, so that's the main culture here, is like recreation culture. And I just wonder what you think. Do you think there is hope for sort of people to engage with the outdoors in a different way in the future? Or do you think we're on this path to just more and more sort of extreme recreation? Or do you think that might evolve in the next coming years in the GYE?
yeah, I sure hope so. And I think I can't discount nor discredit the importance and value of recreation by any stretch. I mean, I don't know that I would be in the place that I am today. I wouldn't be without all the time spent outside playing. But a friend said to me a couple of years ago that I thought was just a beautiful point, that when the activity becomes more important than the place in which the activity is occurring is when, and the respect for that place, that's when you got to start questioning things. And yeah, I wonder and think a lot about the future of unfortunately now it seems, and it's probably been this way for a while, I've just sort of swung a bit myself, of it seems a bit more recreation versus conservation. And really think back to like the original Sierra Club, that was much in part a hiking and climbing mountaineering club. And when the two are able to go more hand in hand, I think, we're not spending our energy on the real important things. The big things, we are sort of infighting instead. I do think that one area where that could drive change is putting emphasis in curriculum, I'm not sure what the terminology is these days, but low impact travel skills, natural history, general ecology awareness could be built into a lot more of the outdoor recreation programs, particularly for kids, I think would be an exciting way and effective to do it, you know, starting at a young age that, hey, I was out on a mountain bike ride 2 weekends ago, and there was a cool mushroom growing on the side of the trail, and then there were grouse whortleberries, and the parents I was with, you know, we stopped, and, you know, this is the same family that's, you know, the 4-year-olds mountain biking on the trails, and they're helping giving them a boost up the trails with a tow rope. So they're having fun recreating, but they're also incorporating appreciation of the place into the recreating.
Yeah.
So I think that's key. And I think, you know, I think a lot of people as they age maybe do transition more to the pure appreciation versus adrenaline, simply because we're forced to. But, you know, I guess the ideal would be is if we are able to, you know, get that in the ethic early on. So.
Yeah, that's really, I've always thought about like how recreation shouldn't be seen as like the end in and of itself, but sort of a catalyst to just engaging with nature, and like it doesn't have to be just about recreation. So that's really interesting to hear. Last question, and take this as you want, but sort of what are 3 pieces of advice that you'd like to offer the audience and the greater world, whether that be books or people or experiences you've had, anything you'd like to offer, sort of 3 pieces of advice?
I liked this one a lot. I mean, I liked all the questions, but so for we did not have a graduation ceremony this spring because of COVID. And so before Yale had organized their virtual ceremony, which was great, I figured, well, I'm gonna make my own graduation ceremony. And so I reached out to all sorts of mentors and friends and family and loved ones and asked the question of them, what advice would you give upon graduating, or what have you learned along the way that's been most helpful, and what question should I keep asking? It was so fun to get all sorts of different responses, and I'm hoping maybe I could turn it into a little book at some point for other graduates. But some of the answers that came back to me that really resonated were just curiosity, keep asking why, the importance of love and relationships, how everyone has a different perspective and how radically different those perspectives can be. And then culture and the importance of both maintaining it in times of crisis in particular, as it really is what people fall back on, but also letting it be a guide in helping you make decisions. You know, if you align with the culture that you are choosing to be a part of or not, you know, whether in work or family or friends. So those are some of the ones that stood out to me that I appreciated. So if any of you are out there, the ones that gave me your advice, thank you. So
those are great and prescient to the times we're in. So
yeah.
I mean, my takeaway is like ask your mentors what they would tell you. Ask people to give you advice. That's like a helpful thing to do.
Yeah.
So thank you, Molly, for that. That was amazing and really insightful. So thank you for offering that. I think we'll open it up to Q&A now. So if you have a question, feel free to type it into the chat box here. And then we'll just kind of answer them.
Copies are available upon request.
I want one of those. I want to know.
I have a haiku collection.
I want to know the full story of Humphrey the Whale. So we have one question here from Ivana. And so I'm just going to sort of paraphrase. So Ivana asks, how does the new landscape around COVID and or recent environmental deregulation open or close opportunities for instituting community-wide restraint in terms of presence in the wild or natural spaces? Do you think
Ooh,
you can answer
that's a
that one?
really
That's a
good
good question.
question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and I don't have a good answer for it at all, because I think it comes down to what I'm a big fan of capital W wilderness areas, and in part because of the tenant that they force us to practice restraint in an age. For those of you unfamiliar with wilderness areas, it's a lot. There are a lot of things. It's a technical legal definition for a type of land, a public land. One of the aspects of it being it's to be as undeveloped as possible, not untrammeled, and there are very specific regulations to what kind of machinery, motorized activities can take place. Really, none without special permission. And one of the reasons I think wilderness is so important is because there are so few instances in life when we're forced to practice restraint. And that's a arena where we are restrained by choice. We're practicing restraint by choice, and practice being different than restraint being forced on you or because of circumstances. And the pushback on those kinds of restraints is tremendous. And to the parallel with COVID is, the masks. Ivana's in California, where there might be more buy-in to masks. I'm in an area where at least my county has a mandate, but around the rest of it, it comes down to personal freedom of the choice to wear a mask or not. So I don't have a good answer for it. And there is the other layer of it is we are getting, at least around here, so many visitors from out of state because people are turning to the outdoors as a refuge of sorts from COVID, as an activity, as a place to actually be with friends. It is one place where you can sort of socially responsibly socialize. And yet a lot of the trails around here, the land is taking a beating. I've talked to a couple of ranger friends who have said, that really concerned for, if this is the future, what the toll on public land is going to be. So you would hope that with the increased use in public land because of COVID, and not even public land, but just the sort of safer space that being outside provides, an increased level of appreciation might occur, or awareness in the value of non-indoor space, the non-human, non-built world. But whether or not we get there, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it has been shocking to see just visitation numbers to Jackson and the area just skyrocket through all of this. And I wonder if that will eventually lead to like recognition of how valuable public lands and spaces like these are, but I'm not sure. I don't know if that's the result. So yeah.
The real estate markets, in talking to friends in other places where natural space is a draw, properties are selling, that haven't sold it, have been on the market for years. It's creating its own set of, there's already housing crunches in a lot of these places for the people that live and work here versus the second homeowners, and it's just exacerbating it tenfold.
Yeah,
people are leaving the city, wanting to get out of the cities and wanting to be in a more natural environment.
Totally. I've heard lots of stories about people that are just blind buying homes in the Jackson area, not even having come here. It's just being bought up. So interesting to see what will come. I kind of have one last question just to see more personal, just like what sort of educational roles do you see yourself in the next however long, the near future? What sort of educational roles do you want to be in?
Oh gosh. Well, I love writing. I see that as a form of education. And I love teaching work, particularly workshops and sort of shorter, more intensive things. So whether that's on writing or policy sciences or some sort of group facilitation type work, we'll see. Or I'm also I did do a part of my degree is a certificate in college preparatory teaching. So, you know, a dream job would be if I could work at one of the universities or tribal colleges or community colleges around here. I'd love to do that. So, or remote as well. So, yeah.
Cool. Well, Molly, thank you so much. We're about at the end of our time here, but I'd like to say thank you so much for taking the time. This was like really wonderful. So thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for asking, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, we have a pretty good crowd here today.
Ending to Humphrey.
And how can we get it? How can we get a copy of that?
He made it. I'll read you the last paragraph just to close. Maybe I'll post it on my website, molly.com. 2 weeks went by, and one day, as if by miracle, Humphrey started to turn around back toward the bay, capital letters. Then Humphrey left. Mixed feelings is misspelled, went around, sad that they knew is misspelled. Spelling was not their strong suit. They would never see Humphrey again, but also happy that he didn't die. Now Humphrey is properly migrating to Baja.
Humphrey made it out. Yes. Oh, love that. I want to read the whole book now. Well, thank you for that, Molly. I want to make a quick plug for our next talk, which will be on September 10th, same time, Thursday at noon, with Katie Christensen, who I think will be another interesting perspective on sense of place, as she is an artist, and she's our artist in resident here at NRCC, and she does a lot of public art installations, and her most recent project was down on Astoria Hot Springs here in Jackson. So Katie will be here on September 10th, so I hope everyone joins us then. Until then, once again, thank you, Molly, for joining us, and I hope everyone stays safe and healthy over the next 2 weeks. So thank you, Molly, and thank you to everybody who joined today.
Thank you.
Okay, bye, everybody.